Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. To say the obvious, remembering September 11 is complicated, and I guess we're going to get into a lot of those complications today, and it's really a pleasure to do it with Michael Arad, who was, as you probably know, selected from 5,201. Were you you're included in that number? Or, okay, so 5,201, including the speaker tonight, competed for the commission to think of the way in which a city could remember this event, and won that competition with a project entitled Reflecting Absence. And there was a huge amount of evolution in the design from the moment of the winning of the competition to the project that opened on Sunday. And I think you'll probably hear quite a bit from Michael about the nature of that evolution. Part of the evolution was to start a collaboration with Peter Walker on the kind of more landscape elements. And each of you will have your own take on the project, and it seems to me that's the whole principle of the project anyway, that to make it possible for everybody to have their own reaction. But just to say the obvious, this is an island, a city that's absolutely phobic of emptiness, doesn't believe in it as a general sort of rule. This goes way beyond sort of finding a vacuum obnoxious. It's just any kind of emptiness is treated as some sort of mistake from the point of view of social life, of real estate development, and so on. So the sort of original gesture of this project to clear space and to sort of emphasize its emptiness, I would say even to emphasize emptiness with a certain way of putting trees into that emptiness, sets the kind of condition for these two holes. These two holes are then, and this park are surrounded by very, very generic towers by famous architects that are really not that interesting at all, I think, and are, or interesting only in as much as they are generic and pretending somewhat desperately to be different from each other, but they clearly become business as usual in every possible sense. So in the end, the project is really about the design of these two holes, which I'm not going to discuss. But just a few thoughts to help frame the discussion. Obviously, millions of people will visit this sort of hyper-public place that we're going to talk about tonight, and I think the lurking danger, not only of our discussion this evening, but also of the project from the beginning, is to actually treat September 11th as an important event, or that is to say, as more tragic than the other horrors in our world, which would be, it seems to me, to perpetuate the ultimate crime in treating some lives as being more important than others. So this, of course, is the difficulty. How does one commemorate the lives of one group of people without privileging those lives over those of others, and therefore, in a way, repeat the force that led to the event in the first place? Now, nothing could be more natural, it seems to me, than to value those closest to you, but actually nothing could be more precious, perhaps, than to value those whose lives seem to be so different and so distant. One idea about cities is that cities are simply machines to bring near and far together. Their great asset is to put you in touch with that which is distant. Urban life is surely all about the mutual embrace of otherness. People of every nation and religion died on that day. And most importantly, I think every city has its tragedies, actually layers and layers and layers of tragedies. No place, especially not New York, has a monopoly on pain. And trauma doesn't simply just happen in cities or to cities. Trauma shapes cities. Usually the memorial is just a very, very small gap or tear in the kind of fabric of the city. There's just a kind of archaeological imprint. Even that part of Manhattan has been the scene of radical, horrific tragedy, particularly with the fire and so on, years ago. The test of a city of cosmopolitan urban life might be how it responds to these endless micro and macro tragedies. 10 years ago, the cruel attack on the tip of the island that is the tip of the United States galvanized the global media as it was intended to do, and was used as a prop by all sides in order to escalate conflict. So it was used as a lever to escalate conflict. And I think in that sense, one tragedy was used to feed countless more. And if just in any sense, like how many people have died, how many nations are traumatized and so on. So I suppose the hope in general, but certainly here in the school, is to find forms of dialogue that embrace urbanity in embracing people and events that we will never fully understand but never wish to forget. So I think the measure of the project that I think you've accomplished so well is its capacity to allow this kind of reflection to continue. So it's in this spirit that it's really a pleasure to have Michael here with us today to talk about his project, which is being received really very, very positively, and all the complications of trying so relentlessly through the last 10 years, and I would say successfully, to make sure that his design didn't become one more victim of the process. And of course, whatever conversation we start today is just not even the tip of the iceberg of a conversation about this project and about such projects in general that will keep going and going and going. But I think if one considers this project as having as its aim the beginning of a different kind of conversation, I think it's an extraordinarily interesting project from so many points of view, and I'm really, in a way, touched that you would agree to come in the week in which we're thinking the most about this to talk about what might be, on one hand, a more mundane question, like how does an architect operate within this impossible assignment, given that nobody else ever has succeeded? How does one possibly operate in that with some dignity and end up with a project that would, as it were, allow for an opening up rather than a closing down? And my personal view is you do succeed, but you know the jury is sitting here waiting to hear from you.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here. And in agreeing to come here today, I think I did that a few weeks ago. I didn't realize how emotionally drained and exhausted I would be at this point. And just a few hours ago, I was wondering what I was going to say and how this was going to come across. Let me say it's a pleasure to be here at Columbia. I applied here back in '94, and this was one of the only schools I didn't get into, so it's good to be here. So here I am. I began to sketch ideas for a memorial just a few months after the attack. And a few weeks ago, I went through sketches and came across something that was dated late October. And it surprised me. I didn't think that I had turned to that language so quickly. It felt a little difficult to try to relate to what I had seen. But I did, and I think everybody that was here in New York and elsewhere in the world, I think tried to find a way to relate to what they had seen. And if you were a writer, you probably wrote. If you were a painter, you probably painted. And as an architect, as a designer, I started to sketch and study these ideas. And one of the first ideas that came to me was the surface of the Hudson River being torn open, forming these two inexplicable voids into which water would rush. And these voids would never fill up. They would remain empty. And it was a very enigmatic image, something that didn't make any sense to me. I wasn't sure if it could be realized, but it was an image that was stuck in my mind, and I decided to spend some time investigating whether or not, can I pull this out, it could be realized. And eventually I constructed a small model, about a foot by a foot. It had a tiny little pump in it, and it pushed water up around the perimeter of the square, and it formed this flat surface of water that then was torn open by these two voids. And I took this little model and photographed it up on the rooftop of my apartment building in the East Village. The same rooftop on which I stood a few months earlier, a year earlier, and saw the second plane strike the South Tower. And I could see, even though I was photographing it facing north in this instance, I could see the absence of the towers and the skyline somehow being mirrored in these two voids in the surface of the river. And I spent close to a year on this personal and private and cathartic exercise. It was a way to come to terms with what I had seen. And then I set it aside. I sort of put it up on a high shelf and forgot about it. I had gone through this process, and I felt that I had completed it. But I came back to it a year later, after the selection of the Levski master plan for the site. And the Lipsky master plan took the 16-acre site and subdivided it into 4 unequal quadrants by bringing Greenwich Street and Fulton Street back through the site. The largest quadrant, measuring some 8 acres in size, was where the towers had once stood, and that served as the setting for the memorial competition. While I agreed with that gesture of trying to tie the site back into the life of the city by restoring that street grid, or partially restoring it, not every street that had been there was going to come back, I was also concerned about how the site would function as it was in that master plan. The site itself was submerged some 30 feet below the surrounding street level, as you can see on the right side of the image. And over what are shown here in a light green, the footprints of the former towers, you had an assembly of buildings, one bridged over the north footprint, one cantilevered over the south footprint. And I thought that this competition really called for a memorial that was going to be part of an assembly of structures, not a memorial plaza. And I actually was drawn to this idea of a memorial plaza. I reflected on my own experiences here in New York after the attacks, how places like Washington Square and Union Square served such an important purpose in bringing us together to respond as a community, to respond collectively. And they weren't just places that brought us physically together, but they brought us together emotionally. They allowed us to offer kindness and compassion to one another. And I know that for me, that it was a rather transformative moment. I had heard for many years in school and in practice how important public space is. But it's not until a moment like the aftermath of an attack like this that you truly see and feel that. And these places that we go to for their farmer's market or to sit on a bench with a friend have a very different way of connecting us together in the aftermath of an attack, or even if it is, if you think of Tahrir Square in Egypt, the way these public spaces have a real social role to play. And I wanted to bring that to this site, this idea of a social space, a space that would be part of the city. And I was concerned that if we created a memorial that would only serve as a memorial ground, that would be cut off from the life of the city, the site would atrophy over time, and it would not actually serve the purpose of memorializing, nor would it serve the city. And so that idea of public space, drawing on my own experiences here in New York, the idea of the voids in the river, and this quarry that I actually came across in South Orange, New Jersey. And there was just something about the geometry of the space, of the material that had been removed, and the sense of both ruin and renewal, of rubble and water and trees and vegetation. And so all of these ideas were percolating together in my head, and I thought, let's take this memorial site, bring it up to grade, define it by its 4 streets that surround it, and carve these 2 voids into this large, flat memorial plaza where people could gather around the voids and look down, or stand in a cloister-like space in a memorial gallery behind that waterfall and encounter the names. And that led to this competition entry, which I submitted. And you can't read the text here, but on the very last paragraph talks, the first few talk about the experience of the memorial, and I'll go into greater detail on that. But what I ended up on was describing the role of this urban plaza as a place that would welcome people on their way to work and play. And I chose to end on that word, play, because I thought it was very important to think of the site as a living part of the city, as a site that would welcome these different uses. So here you see everything being brought up to grade, these 2 large voids carved into the surface of this plaza, and then these memorial galleries which would ring the voids where you would encounter the names of the victims. And that moment of coming up to the edge of these voids, of seeing this large space that you can only stand at the periphery of and never enter, this threshold, this line of names which separated the living from the dead, was a very important moment. I thought it was the most powerful moment in this experience, a moment where the scale of the towers would be echoed in the size of this void, and the multitude of names around each void would together convey a very powerful and direct message to visitors to this site. was one of 8 finalists which were selected in late 2003, and I came to see the site at that point. I saw the Slurry Wall, which Daniel Libeskind spoke at length about, and I could see why he saw beauty in it, and why he wanted to keep that site some 30 feet below street level to expose this wall. But I thought we could actually preserve this wall within a memorial museum that would be located below the plaza. So in essence, by bringing the grade up and linking to the sidewalks and streets around us, the space could become an internal space. And another trace of the site that I was very moved by seeing were these cutoff columns. And these were the steel columns which once connected the towers to their foundation. And in the recovery effort, when all of the debris was removed from the site, these columns were torch cut right at grade in that lowest basement of the World Trade Center complex. And they left a powerful trace of what had been here and is no longer. And I think that was something that was important to me, this notion of making visible what is absent, not through its reconstruction, not through building another tower or putting a new steel column where this one once stood, but by actually showing its absence, making it clear. So as a finalist, I developed some materials for the jury to review, and you can see these materials here. You see this memorial plaza now populated with some eastern white pine trees, the development of some of these materials, the descent ramps which would bring you right up to the very edge of the voids where you would encounter the names. And here the names were shown on these sort of bronze panels, and a space that was open to beyond. And I thought that was important, those visual connections to the city, but also filtering that view of the city, not being within Manhattan, but also seeing it almost as if you are from afar. And this memorial plaza served as both a prologue and an epilogue to that experience of encountering the names, of walking down these ramps into these memorial galleries. And when I showed these materials to the jury, they expressed a lot of concern about how stark and austere this memorial plaza was. And they pressed me to push forward that idea that I described of making this a place that will welcome people at work, people at play. And they felt that as I had shown the plaza in these renderings and in this model, it still felt like it was overly dedicated to memorial use and might inhibit other uses. And I could understand that criticism. It went to the heart of this notion of trying to tie the site back into the life of the city, what drove me to bring that site up and link it to the surrounding streets and sidewalks. But I was also very hesitant about how would I develop a landscape design that would not conflict with that first primary design gesture of this flat plane and these two voids. And it took me a while to find a way to do that. If we would have had a very clear repetitive grid of trees, or if we would have had a very figural shape here, they would have conflicted with the clarity of these two voids in that flat plane. And I actually consulted with a good professor of mine from Georgia Tech, Doug Allen, who taught me landscape architecture and history of urban form, and he made a very cryptic remark, as professors sometimes do. And he said, "Oh, think of it as a tablecloth." And I had no idea how to unpack that comment. And I spent a couple of days thinking about it, and I'm not sure if this is what he meant, but this is how I understood it. A tablecloth conforms to the shape of the table. It's sort of, it doesn't have its own logic in a sense. And so if the table is round or square, that tablecloth will conform to that shape. And here we had a very clear design, and so almost like a tablecloth, we could push and pull these paving bands to meet the edge of a void, to meet the edge of the ramp, and create a series of paving bands of different widths. Some could be wide, some could be narrow, that would unify the plaza and that material treatment and extend from edge to edge. And then along these bands, along the center of these bands, trees could be arrayed on random intervals. And I described it as an abacus-like bands. So the same way that beads can sort of flow freely along the wires of an abacus, there is an order to where they can be on one axis, but they can stop anywhere along that axis. They might be 20 feet apart in one instance, then 30, and then 12. And what that did, it allowed us to sort of come in a lower register, in a sort of a softer order, one that did not compete with that gesture of the two voids puncturing that flat plane. And we ended up orienting these bands east-west rather than north-south, as you see here. And I came back to the jury with an interim rendering that showed that idea, substituting the eastern white pines, which were criticized for shedding limbs, and with sycamore trees, London plane trees, like the ones you'd see at Cadman Park or at Bryant Park. And I also had the opportunity to come back to the jury with a model that I could define the extent of. That other model that I showed you, where you just saw this plaza sort of floating in this big black vacuum, was similar to the 7 other finalist models. It showed no context, and I thought it was very important to actually show the urban context here, to explain how this site really functions and is defined by the walls of the buildings which will rise around it. And if you think of how clearly you read Central Park because of the walls of Fifth Avenue and Central Park West to its east and west. This space too, I think, depends to a great extent on the clarity of these walls which will encompass it. And the scale of the space, which looked overwhelming when you looked at it in isolation, all of a sudden almost looked like a pocket park in relationship to the buildings all around it. And the design was selected at that point in January of 2004. And these were the images which were released at the time. And we went to work on realizing this design in all its details, how we would deal with queuing, where an information desk might be, how would we have access to bathrooms. And then we also went about solving all sorts of other technical issues, for example, the waterfalls. One of the first questions we had to address was whether the water would cling to the surface of the wall, as you see here in Paley Park, where you actually use a lot of water on a very rough surface to agitate the surface of the water, and you have to cant the surface of that wall, or whether we would have the water sort of free-falling over the edge of the Weir, as you see in this fountain at the World Financial Center. And we opted to follow that second direction of that Weir, in part because we wanted the water to fall further away from the memorial galleries, so that when you stood in that space behind that waterfall, as that water moved in and out, you would be somewhat shielded from it. We tested it in Toronto in our fountain designer's backyard. We built a corner of the fountains. His neighbor was not happy. We had to take it down after 1 year. We tested it in the summer. We tested various profiles for the serrations on the Weir, and these serrations do something quite remarkable, and I think this came out of this design investigation. They separate this inch of water that goes over the top of the Weir into individual streams, which are on 1.5-inch centers. And they look almost like individual strands, like ropes of water as they come off that edge. They flatten out, and then they form this perfect tube of water that, as it falls down 30 feet, the clarity of that individual line dissipates. And you lose that definition of these individual lines. It becomes this diffuse tapestry of water. And I saw something very beautiful in that. One of the things that I think is intrinsic to this memorial design is that it tries to highlight individual loss, but also put it in the context of this communal loss, this loss that we all suffered that day. And I saw that in the way these streams of water sort of came together, lost their individuality, and became this diffuse curtain of water. We developed the bronze panels, which the names would be inscribed on, and you can see the quality of the light coming through the water across the bronze panels, what it might have looked like at night. And for a variety of reasons, we were asked to eliminate these memorial galleries, and I was captured by this image that came out in 2006. It was one of these temporary pools that were built on site for family members who gathered there every year for a commemoration ceremony. And this firefighter kneeling there at the edge of that pool captured very much what I thought would happen within the memorial galleries, that they were a secular space that was set aside for contemplation, for sort of a very spiritual moment, and a moment that I felt had to be shielded architecturally, to create an enclosure there to really support that moment of vulnerability, of standing there and confronting what had happened here that day, seeing all these names. And we were asked for a number of reasons. It had to do with budget, but also with security and with apprehension expressed by some family members to move these names from the memorial galleries up 30 feet to plaza level. And so I felt this is it. One of the mock-ups that we built out at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, very much like I was standing there at the edge of the void and I had nothing there. What would we build there? How would we capture what was intended to happen at that very edge of that void, that moment of encounter, that difficult moment of sad comprehension? And over the next few years, we went through dozens and dozens of studies and alternatives and ideas to try and recapture that moment of communion with the names. And one idea that we explored was to end the memorial plaza and begin a water table that would be level with it. And then the water would fall down into the void, and the surface of that water would be broken by the names of the victims inscribed, either as raised letters breaking the surface of the water, or cut through panels which might be suspended right above the water. Another idea that we explored was this idea of a bronze vessel, that sculptural-like shape that would ring the voids, and water would well out of the very top of it. And on one side, these tiny little rivulets of water would come across the names, and then on the other side, a torrent would fall. So it was something that whispered in one direction and was very loud in the opposite direction. And there was a certain beauty to this idea too. And these are just two of literally dozens and dozens of ideas in different variations. And this long process occurred during a very challenging time. As you know, there was a lot of pressure to complete this project on time. There were questions as to why it was taking so long. What was the design resolution? And I think a lot of credit should go to the Bloomberg administration and to people like Amanda Burden and Kate Levin, who represented the administration and made sure that every step of the way we were able to keep the design on true to its character, even as we encountered these constraints and obstacles that we had to address. And that is a tremendous luxury. I think most people within that sort of set of circumstances, with all of the negative press and this constant drumbeat, let's just build it and move on, would have picked a design or any of these designs that we would have come up with that weren't quite right and said, let's just do that and move forward. But we were able to, we were given the space to find the right response, the response that would keep this memorial true to its character. And I think the design that you see today came out of all of that investigation, of that lengthy process. And it is about creating this 8-foot wide water table that rings the voids and serves as the springing point for the waterfalls. It's a 2-foot high water table. And then suspended above it is this bronze sculptural element that is made of a 1/2-inch thick bronze plate. It sort of folds and has 5 sides to it. And the names are cut right out of the thickness of this material, and they form shadows during the day. And at night, these panels are illuminated from within, as are the waterfalls, and these names appear as light. It's quite beautiful, and I have a few images that I'll be able to share with you now that we have completed that. But this brings me to another topic, which is the names. And I think more than any other part of this design, the arrangement of the names had to be the most contentious issue. And one question, and it wasn't a question that I had an answer to when I began this process. When I first sent in my competition entry, I had no idea of how the names would be arranged. And this was a problem that did not present a quick or easy answer. One question that we had was, would we recognize first responders in any way? And how could we do that without creating a hierarchy? And one idea that I had suggested was that we would have an insignia. And I don't know if you can see that insignia next to one of these names. Or this one suggested a Maltese cross, the symbol of the fire department for a firefighter, for example, or a shield for a police officer. But the question of how the names would be arranged, I think, was something that was incredibly important to family members because it inferred value. It suggested meaning. And I thought that the most important thing to do was to go to the most essential element, which was that sense of an individual life being lost, that sense of personhood, and what better way to capture that than through a person's name? What is more personal than that? And when I suggested in 2004 that we would reach out to family members and ask them if there are names of other victims of that attack that they would like to see next to the name of the person that they lost, and use that information as an armature for developing an arrangement that could capture the complexity of relationships that existed between the victims. And we had many family members and friends and co-workers and neighbors that perished that day, and wouldn't it be appropriate to try and find a way to bring that into the design? That idea was shot down because it seemed like it would be a logistical hurdle that would just be too difficult to accomplish. That reaching out to 3,000 families and asking them to participate in this process would result in could not be resolved. And so that idea of meaningful adjacency had to be set aside, and I couldn't come up with another idea that I thought treated all names equally. And you know, something as simple as an alphabetical listing wasn't going to work, because you have some family members that shared the same last name, but others that didn't. An alphabetical listing would privilege some over others. We had people that actually shared the same name, not just the same first and last name, but the first, middle, and last name. And I could imagine their family members coming to the memorial and seeing these two names side by side and not knowing which one belonged to them. And that just seemed cruel and inappropriate. And so what was intended to look like a random arrangement of names that was going to be pinned by these connections became a random arrangement of names. And that was a very difficult decision to make, because I knew it would mean that family members who by right should be next to one another, friends who should be next to one another, wouldn't be there. But it seemed like the only equitable way to resolve this issue. And for 2 years, that was the design that held its place in the design of the memorial. But what it did is it angered and frustrated family members who felt that the arbitrariness of it was adding insult to injury. And they came together, multiple groups of family members, to come up with an alternate arrangement for the arrangement of the names. And it was based on 5 points. People should be their names should be inscribed at the pool that corresponded to the tower in which they had been. People should be listed by the firm that they worked for. The firms should be listed alphabetically, and then under the firm, the people should be listed alphabetically along with their age and floor. If they had a rank, let's say within the fire department or police department, then that rank should be included. And I felt that what that did is it started to take the names and break them down into smaller and smaller categories and draw lines of division rather than the sense of something that united people that day. And it also it started to take away from the poetry of this arrangement and suggest something that looked more like a directory. And the last thing I wanted was something that looked like a list, even in its graphic arrangement. So whereas one had stacked columns, I thought we should stagger the names, not to give each and every name an individual place that was its own. And in 2006, when the mayor became chairman of the Memorial Foundation, this was one of the first issues that he wanted to address, because it was hindering fundraising. Construction and design were sort of on hold until this was going to get resolved. And we met at Gracie Mansion and we talked at length about this. And the mayor very much is a data-driven person and thought about this at length and all the sort of the complexity and issues which would come out of this. And we decided to break the names into 9 broad categories, which reflected where people were that day geographically. So you have the 4 flights, the 2 towers and the Pentagon, the 93 bombing victims, which all perished near the North Tower footprint, and the first responders. And the first responders, in turn, grouped by where they came from the same firehouse, the same precinct building. He agreed, which I think is remarkable, and I'm still kind of in disbelief that it happened, to bring back this idea of meaningful adjacency, that we would reach out to the family members, and within these groups, and also from one group to another, the names would be arranged in a way to capture the requests to family members. And finally, in 2009, a letter went out to family members asking them to verify the name of the person that they lost, but also to let us know if there are other names which they would like included next to the name of the person that they lost. And we got over 1,200 requests, and sort of beware of what you wish for. All of a sudden, you know, and that's why I think it was remarkable that we were given this opportunity, because we didn't know how well we would be able to address this. And normally somebody in political office is going to be very leery of something that its outcome is unknown, that has the potential of privileging some but not others. And we then spent the next year arranging the names very carefully and deliberately. And as we started this process rather late, we went about it in two very different ways. One was sort of very high-tech, one was low-tech. The high-tech way was we worked with local projects, and they developed a software program that was connected to a database that had tabulation of all of the requests, and it had a graphic interface where you could literally pull, sort of drag and drop names from one panel to the next, move them from one row to the next, and keep track of how many adjacency requests were being met. And the low-tech way was that we took each and every name and we printed it at a quarter scale. So we had cards which were short or long, depending on the length of the name, and in addition to the name, we wrote other information that was pertinent on the periphery of that card, other names that it should be next to, other which group it should be with. When we didn't get a request, we tried to group people with their coworkers. And one person at our office spent close to a year just arranging the names, moving these cards around, and it was an incredible labor of love. It was emotionally draining, and I'm still amazed that she was able to do all of this. And she would arrange these cards on these cardboard racks. You know, a 10-foot panel became a 2.5-foot cardboard panel. We had 5 of them in a row. You'd move these little cards from one to the next, take a picture of them, transcribe it on the computer, print it out on at a quarter scale so you could pin it up and see an expanse of it, because really you couldn't see one panel at a time. You always had to think of it as part of a continuum. And that's how we did the South Pool. The North Pool we did with the aid of that computer program. And there was also a graphic component to this arrangement. The names had to relate to the requests that we got, but they also had to, we didn't want to create breaks that ran from the top to the bottom. We wanted each name to have a space that was its own, and the only place where a break would occur is when you transition from one group to another group, from Flight 11 to the North Tower, for example. So this process took a long time, but at the end of it, we were able to meet each and every request, and it was a very satisfying moment to get to that point. It felt like an incredible achievement. But throughout this process, we learned a little bit about why some of these requests were made. And what that does is it takes that very hard number, close to 3,000 dead, and breaks it down into something that we can relate to. When you hear an individual story, when you hear about 2 brothers that perished that day, one who was a firefighter and one who was a police officer, when you hear the story of a young woman who lost her father that day, he was on Flight 11, and she lost her best friend from college that day. She was working at the North Tower, and that flight crashed into the North Tower, and we were able to end the names associated with Flight 11 with her father's name and begin the names associated with the North Tower with her friend's name. And for her, I think it's very meaningful to come to the memorial and see those 2 names side by side. But when you hear that story, it's a way to connect to the toll of that day that it had on so many individual families and build up an understanding story by story. And I think that that's important, and there's a way to do that with the general public, whether it's through printed materials, whether it's through audio guides or video guides. You can find a way to share these stories and have an impact allow people to connect to the history of that day on the site. It seemed like we were set to move forward with the design, with the names, with the form, and then we got a call from the mayor's office of people with disabilities. And they were very concerned about the fact that when you were seated in a wheelchair, you could see and touch the names very clearly, but you could not see that void at the center of each pool where the water disappears into what seems like a bottomless abyss, because that 42-inch high peak of the names panel blocked the view for some short-statured people in wheelchairs. And you can imagine at a moment like that, a lot of bad ideas sort of bubble up to the surface immediately. You know, could we put a scissor lift on the plaza so that portions of the plaza will go up and down? Could we substitute some bronze panels with glass panels? Could we cut openings between the panels to allow people to see through? And you know, the intention was really to have this continuous ring of names around each pool. And you can see these attempts to try and keep within the design language, within the DNA of this design, while addressing this request, did not feel organic to the nature of the design. And a design like this, it's so economical in its means of expression. Everything has to be there for a reason. It can't feel tacked on or added after the fact to address an issue. And after thinking about this for a few weeks, and again, every day was valued, I thought that we could chamfer the corners of the pools, and that by cutting the corner off, by sort of snipping this little triangle off the end, we brought people closer in to the inside edge of that void, to the edge of the Weir where the water spills over and into the void. And by doing so, we allowed better sight lines for people who were for everyone, but more importantly, for people who were seated in wheelchairs. And we came back to the MOPD with this idea, and they said, that's great, but you know, you have to sort of parallel park next to the edge and look over your shoulder, and not everybody can do that. Some people have limited mobility, and at that point, you were just ready to pull every last hair out of your head. But I thought, well, we cut it in plan, let's cut it in section. And so instead of having a flat wall, the wall sort of cantilevers up and out, almost like the prow of a ship. And I actually think that because of this constraint, and because of the way that we were able to solve it, the design became better in many ways. I realized that the towers themselves had chamfered corners, something that wasn't important for me to allude to in the design when I was looking at the names, but when we had to solve this problem, it seemed like a way to sort of gently comment on the shape of the original towers. And more importantly, it allowed us to take the names, and instead of stopping them at the corner and then starting them once we turned it, to wrap the names continuously around the corner. So we go from 5 rows to 3 and then back to 5. And that poetically is much more appropriate, and sculpturally, I think the corner is much better resolved now. So again, I think as long as you have a clear idea of what the design is, it can accommodate constraints, and which design is always, at the end of the day, about constraints. There's always limitations, and it's about finding the response to these limitations that keeps your project on track. A few pictures from the fabrication process, from the mock-ups out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, from the testing of the lights, seeing the material, you know, at different times of the day and different weather and different times of the year, and really thinking about how this is an outdoor experience, testing the materials, selecting stone, developing the landscaping, the trees being gathered at this field in New Jersey, and then being brought to the site in this caravan, and really creating this sort of this urban park with a memorial at its heart. And I wanted to show a few of these images just to sort of show the process, what is going to look like terra firma, and what most of our visitors will never think of it. They're actually standing on a green roof of a 60-foot high building. It is linked seamlessly to the surrounding streets and sidewalks, but it is not. There's actually quite a lot underneath us. It's quite complex, and a project like this, even without its sort of emotional and political and you know, various conflicting beliefs about what we should do and how we commemorate, would have a hard time being built here. But at the end of the day, for me, I think it's about both looking back, but also making visible what is absent, about bringing that persistent sense of absence to the everyday. And I would normally end my presentation there, but you know, this Sunday we opened the memorial, and for me that was an incredibly word is, actually. It was both a sad and happy day in many ways. It was remarkable to see how that missing ingredient, the public, came in and changed the memorial and made it their own. And I think that's really what we did. We sort of set the stage. We brought all of these inanimate objects to the site to create that opportunity for people to come together here. As people came together, I think, in New York after the attack, and reflect on the past, but also create a place that is going to be part of New York, that relates to New York, that allows for, for families to come together here, but also for kids to run around. People will use this memorial in different ways, and it was just a little overwhelming, and to be there, and I almost felt as if I was intruding in some way. Monday was easier in some ways. That was the day that we opened it to the public, and it was, and I think that's important. But I think at the end of the day, this is a memorial site, and for the first few months, it will function almost purely as a memorial site, but it is also part of New York. It is a place where I want to see office workers coming down out of those office buildings, crossing the street, sitting under a park bench, chit-chatting with a friend. I want to see neighborhood residents walking through here. I want to see this become a living part of New York again. And as the surrounding streets and sidewalks are completed, as the construction fences come down, you'll see that happen. And Sunday and Monday were the beginning of a new chapter in the life of the site. But over time, I think the site will become part of New York again, as it should be. Thank you. I'd be happy. Yep. There have to be questions. Okay.
Yeah. The memorial had a global timeline, and then they have to top 2 years off the timeline. How on earth did you? What did you compromise to make to reduce the 2 years, to reduce the timeline?
Well, I think somebody like Chris Ward from the Port Authority could speak with more authority than I can about that, but you have to really think of the project not by itself, but as part of a number of different projects which were going on simultaneously on the site. So for example, a portion of the Memorial Plaza, the northeast portion of it, is the roof of the PATH station below us. And so they had to make changes to how they were going to approach building that project. So there's a whole number of interconnected parts here that accelerating the schedule for the memorial meant changing how you were going to do some of the rest. And I think the mayor made it a priority to open the memorial on the 10th anniversary. The mayor, paradoxically, actually has very little say on what happens on that site because it's owned and managed by the Port Authority, which is a bi-state agency, and it's almost like the Vatican in the middle of Rome. They have their own police force there. It's just different. But it had to do with the way in which the sequence of multiple projects was going to be carried out.
How difficult was it for you emotionally to have the original concept change with the underground passageway and all that?
That was one of the more challenging moments, and I think, especially as a young designer, I began this process when I was 34, and a couple years into it, that's when this occurred. And I think we tend sometimes to conflate the architectural expression of an idea with the idea itself. And what was most important about the architecture, about these memorial galleries, was not the quality of their space, that cloister-like tall vertical space that rang the voids and had this open wall on one side and this open tear on one side and this solid wall on the other. It was about that moment of encountering the names. And I had to find a way to recapture that. But of course, I was very hesitant about it and fearful to some degree of would we find a way to hold on to what was most important here, that idea of confronting the names, of standing at the edge of that threshold and sheltering that experience. And I think all of these studies that came thereafter were really about trying to recapture that. And I think the sound of the water, the way that the trees have been brought right up to the edge of the void to form a canopy overhead, the extent of this bronze plate where the names are inscribed on, together capture what was intended to happen. And in some ways, I think, have actually distilled the design down to its most essential elements. We haven't lost that intent, that character of the memorial. But in 2006, I didn't know that that's how it would end up. So you can understand why I was apprehensive about that change.
Did you say there's going to be a way for the public to learn about the stories and the names?
Yeah, there's actually already an application that's available online, but also on phones and iPads that allows you to find names. So if you're looking for a particular name, you can find it either by name, by town, by employer. I mean, there's multiple fields. You can just type something. But we've also added another aspect to that application recently, using some of the recordings that have been made by StoryCorps downtown. So you can actually listen to some of the stories. So I think there's a dozen or so oral histories that are already available on that phone app that you can walk up to a certain panel and hear the recollection of somebody talking about people that they lost. So for example, the Vigiano brothers, one of them firefighter, one was a cop. Their father, who was a firefighter, talks about them when they were young kids. And when you stand next to that panel and you hear this recording, it's incredibly powerful. But I think you don't need the authority of the Memorial Foundation to be the sole conduit for these stories. I think many people could choose to make their own vehicles for presentation of this information. The panels that are arranged around the pools, there are 76 panels around each pool, and each panel has a panel numerator on it. So you have N1 through 76 for the North Pool and S1 through 76 for the South Pool. And when you're looking for a particular name, you know, let's say on panel N12, you're looking at 22 names on average on a given panel, and it's very easy to find a name that way. So I imagine that in the future you might be able to go to panel N24 and hear a story. It might be something that's sort of sanctioned, so to speak, by the Memorial Foundation, but it might be something that somebody else came up with altogether. Once that information is there, it's embedded within the design, it can be teased out in many different ways. And that information is something that no designer could have come up with by themselves. This had to be the process that engaged many people and allowed them to bring that information into the design. How it's then kind of pulled back out, I think, again, the public could find ways to do that.
Thank you for a fantastic talk. I had a quick question about how your design, and of course it's a long process of design, anticipated popular practices of remembrance, American practices of remembrance, and thought to maybe deflect them or anticipate them or build on them and so on. And to what degree were other people involved in the design pushing for those kind of practices of remembrance that we're all familiar with? I'm thinking specifically about the Vietnam Memorial.
You're thinking of rubbings, right?
Excuse me?
Rubbings?
Well, the sunken move,
Yeah.
the color, the blackness, the move towards abstraction. The rubbings, of course,
Yeah.
the kind of tactility, but also, and so following on that,
Yeah.
what has happened to the Vietnam Memorial, which is that now there's all these small memorials that, in a sense, are attempting to compensate for the abstractness of the Vietnam Memorial with these figurative, memorials of statues, doing
Yeah.
different things and whatnot. So anyway, if you could comment on that.
So when I was on the site on Sunday, I was surprised by how people have appropriated the memorial, made it their own, and found ways to communicate with it that I couldn't have. anticipated. But one thing that was important to me all along was this very tactile relationship between people coming to the memorial and touching it and feeling it. And I don't think that the images really convey how you feel this memorial. Even the void itself, it doesn't. You don't see it at a distance. It's sort of that water table cuts that view off, and it's not until you're very much at the edge of the void, the last 2-3 feet, before you're right at the name panel, that all of a sudden this void seems to open up under you, and it has a very sort of, you feel it right in your gut. It has almost, it's destabilizing in a way. But we had, requests all along the way. One of the reason I asked about the rubbings was because we had one board member that kept going back to that again and again. Will we be able to make rubbings at this memorial? And you remember one of the earlier iterations that I showed where you had water running across the names. I spent, so much time trying to figure out, can we make a rubbing across something like that? I was like, well, if you use Tyvek paper and a Conti crayon, you can actually do a rubbing on a wet surface. So you're trying to think of, it just became, this sort of tunnel vision. If we had to do that, how would we do that? But I don't think you can anticipate all the ways in which a memorial like this could be used. And one thing that people start putting little stones on the panel. Somebody drew a little spiral of stones on one name. Somebody left a can of beer next to another name. I mean, you can just a whole range of responses. When it comes to this issue of more literal representation, I think in some ways this is a very literal representation. It is exactly where these towers stood. And when you stand at the edge of these names, you're standing within the tower footprint. The dimensions of the tower are exactly delineated by that first row of trees, which rings the voids and creates a 10-foot wide walk space around the panels. And I think that is unlike most memorials. Most memorials do not occur where people perished. And obviously we have names here of people that died in Pennsylvania and in Virginia as well, but the vast majority of these names are people who died right here. So I think there is, that's not an abstraction. Yeah.
In the initial design stages, were you influenced or inspired at all by the negative space sculptures of Michael Heiser?
No, I think I'm aware of them, and as a designer, I think you sort of draw on all of, that visual vocabulary that you accumulate over a lifetime. And I've been asked, as somebody who's from Israel, are there Israeli elements to this? I grew up in Mexico too. I can see Monte Alban and Chichen Itza in this just as well. For me, that image of the two voids in the river sort of came inexplicably. I don't know where it came from, and it was about finding that, that tugging on the end of that string and then following it and seeing where it would lead to, and spending, close to a year just trying to understand if that could be realized, that image, and then that led to another thing. And that secondary void that is at the center of each pool, which I can certainly see the affinity to Heiser's work, came out of the desire to capture that initial gesture of the void in the river, of that water disappearing and leaving that vessel empty.
I know your father was the Israeli ambassador to the United States, and increasingly right-wing evangelical Christian America. Was there any resistance to an Israeli American designing the memorial?
I don't think so. And I've always been somewhat leery of being identified as a designer who is, Israeli or Jewish or male. I don't think these categories, I think they're reductive in a sense. They don't really, I think we're more complex than that, and that we don't fit into neat boxes very easily.
Something from the other side, so to speak. Way up in the back there.
Has always been people doing things in spaces they shouldn't. And I really appreciated the images of people using the memorial in ways you didn't think, but I'm wondering if you had any consideration for the design, say 20 years or 30 years or 50 years from now, when the memorial, like an appropriate plan for social decay in which the sort of fabric of New York takes over the memorial so that maybe the memorial stops being one, or that, you know, other things happen? Like, did you?
I don't think that the people use these spaces in a way that they shouldn't. I think public spaces are actually incredibly resilient and allow for these different activities to go on side by side. And I think that's what, that's the value that I saw in them, that they can be a place for, you know, fun and frivolity one minute and a memorial service the next. And for me, there was one moment in particular that I recall from the week that followed that attack when I made my way to Washington Square late at night. I was living in the East Village, and everything south of 14th Street was cordoned off, so it was like walking through a ghost town. And I arrived at that square, and there were a dozen or so people standing around the fountain in the middle of the square, and just walking up to the edge of that fountain and standing in that circle of people felt like, you know, almost like a switch went off, and this feeling of being alone in the face of that death and destruction sort of changed to responding as a New Yorker, as part of this community. I'd been living in New York for about 2.5 years at that point, and that sense of being an outsider in New York just disappeared. That sort of the crucible of that event brought us all together and held us together for a long time. And so I think public space, you know, whatever, I trust in our collective values that we will use the space in an appropriate way. And what that means will change over time, and that's exactly right. That's what it should be. I think it's about creating a public space that allows for these different expressions, for it to be one thing one week and something altogether different at a different time.
Let's grab a couple more. There was one more way up in the back.
Yes. In these times that we live, where it's difficult to distinguish the way it was so easily in the past, self and other, a monument such as this, or the one for the Vietnam War, really has to somehow address the challenge of honoring as well the other people involved in the event that transpired. In the case of the Vietnam War Memorial, the number of names that are remembered falls short by about 5 million people. Here, we can't even count the number yet. So I'd like to ask you a polemical question, which I think is really quite appropriate, because this ultimately should be a monument to peace that unfortunately has also become a justification for war. How would you, if you would so like to, add to this monument to cause people to remember those other persons that have been killed as a result of these events?
I think what I envisioned at that moment of standing at the edge of the void is trying to encourage a moment of introspection, of contemplation, of really allowing that moment to, in some ways, not shut out life and the city and everything around you, but sort of create a filter between you and that, and give you the opportunity to use that moment for reflection, to repeat something I've said before, something like a built equivalent of a moment of silence. That when you come to the edge of that void, you can forget about the sort of the everyday concerns that might be in the forefront of your thoughts, and let the history of that day sort of come up. And how you respond to that, I think, greatly depends on what you bring to the memorial. I think some people will walk away from this memorial angered. Others might find hope and understanding. I can tell you that as I've worked on this project over the last 8 years, I've come in touch with a number of remarkable people who lost loved ones that day, and the way in which they've tried to respond to what happened that day in a constructive way of reaching out, of building bridges, of educating, of trying to prevent an event like this from happening again, and trying to prevent some of these other casualties that you're talking about, is remarkable. I'm not sure that I would have had the same capacity to respond to a calamity like this in such a fashion as they have. But I don't think that there is a single correct response to coming to the site, a single message that I can impart. I think it depends greatly on what you bring with you to the site, and it will vary from person to person. but if that site can trigger introspection and trigger this notion of engagement, of bringing the past into the present and reflecting on how we take the legacy of that day and other days and change the present, then I think that's successful.
The last question,
I had the opportunity to enter the competition, but I was not a winner with Yale students, and I struggled with the meaning of the event, as Mark has so eloquently in his introduction alluded to the tragedy of the whole event. And as it's been a decade now since the event happened, there's a growing segment of the population that's not just concerned about the mythological quality and the healing and the rebuilding of Lower Manhattan, but the truth element. There's a growing segment of 9/11 truthers who are concerned about the truth element, not just memorializing a fiction, but actually getting to truth, where the truth sets us free. I'm wondering if within the past 10 years, you've been struggling with what the New York Times on Monday alluded to, the suppression in the media, as well as in the discourse in architecture schools, in the academy, of the truth element of this whole event, and how has it impacted you as a human being?
I'm not sure I'd respond to that question other than to say that I feel the history of the site is incredibly powerful and charged, and as a designer, it was important to not bring yourself as somebody that was going to try and embellish or comment on in a personal way, but to let the history of that site come through design in the most direct and unmediated way. And I thought that marking the footprints of the towers and listing the names of the victims does that. And a more explicit narrative, one that involves, timelines and names and facts and dates, is going to be exhibited within the Memorial Museum, which I'm not involved in. It's situated below the Memorial Plaza, and I think that that's a very challenging history to write, and one that's contested and will likely be edited and rewritten many times, and I doubt we'll ever have some sort of universal agreement on it.
So I just want to thank Michael for his care in explaining the project. For those of you who are wondering, the Snow Header building will dissolve after 10 years, which would restore the original concept of Michael's project. And that I think is going to be for the good. But I think, yeah, I think that, of course, it's a more or less impossible situation to end the conversation at this point, and we have more questions in the room, and deeper and deeper we would go. And I think it's pretty obvious from Michael's answers that he would be a companion in that discussion as it got deeper and as it got more critical and as it got more nuanced. And some of you may do that in private, but for now I think just to thank Michael for having, as it were, protected his own concept. It's more or less impossible. When he began the project, he was what would be officially described as a young architect. What was he, 30, 35? He's now what would be perhaps correctly called an ancient architect, after sort of 10 years in the sort of time and version of this process. But to have survived is quite something. Congratulations.